Okay, let's start. I can start if you want. So I'm Sara. I'm the community manager of Frictionless Data. Most of you already know me. You've seen me probably on other calls. And I'm really excited to hear Dave's presentation today. I'll pick someone else. Jonathan, do you want to go ahead?
Yeah, my name is Jonathan Mitchell. I live in Washington State in the US, and I'm a developer. It's my day job, but I have some side projects that deal with data and data drops. So I like the frictionless data effort, and I want to get better at it. So that's why I'm here. Let's see, how about Tiago?
Hi, I'm Tiago. I'm a postdoc in Uppsala in Sweden, and I've been working mostly with phylogenetics. And I found out about frictionless when we had actually my previous position. We had kind of an in-house solution for linguistic phylogenetic data, and I had to implement a frictionless alternative, an internal one. And I don't think people are using that, but it's there somewhere in their repository. So should I pick someone? I don't know.
Yes, please.
The next one in my list is Dave.
Okay, that's me. So hi, I'm Dave. I run a project called Libraries Hacked and have done for about the last almost 10 years or so, which is all about public library data and using public library data with a strong focus on open data, which I know Frictionless Data has a kind of a sort of good collaboration with in a sort of community sense. So I'm going to be talking today about public library data and how one particular project that linked it together with some frictionless data standards. So I'm looking forward to giving a demo on that today. And shall I go for Sheila?
Hello, everyone. I'm Sheila Bennett. I am the person that leads the government team dealing with public libraries policy, and I am passionately concerned about improving the data situation across public libraries in England. The slight twist being that the government doesn't run them, local government runs them, so therefore we cannot necessarily mandate approaches or only without an enormous political dust-up. My previous roles, I've worked in government digital service where I was quite concerned with the sort of whole issue of data and how that linked in with government services. And prior to that, I worked in local government. Shall I pass on to Logan?
Sure. Hi, everyone. I'm Logan Byers. I work at the World Resources Institute, which is a global nonprofit focused on environmental and sustainable development. I work in our research, data, and innovation team. So I'm interested in this from the standpoint of metadata standards and kind of ability to, the kind of open data documentation kind of things. So that leaves Lily and Oleg, I believe, as the last two. I think Lily's pointing towards Oleg, maybe on her screen.
Okay. Thanks very much, Tiago. And sorry, thank you, Logan. And yeah, I mean, I've been called out already. I've been on a few of these calls since I've been supporting the Frictionless Data Project for a long time, but I'm actually working from Switzerland for the Swiss chapter of Open Knowledge, Open Data CH, and which I've been supporting for almost 10 years. And inside of that chapter, we have a working group, which is very active, called Open GLAM. Which maybe is a term that you're all familiar with, but it's open galleries, libraries, archives, museums, libraries being a very prominent member of that trio. And the and I've been working in like IT for maybe 20 years, a software developer, but I can definitely trace back my interest and career in computing to libraries when I was in my school, helping to run the local infrastructure, feeling much less bored than I was in class. And yeah, so today I run various projects which more or less involve frictionless data. For example, one where we're looking at the way cities are developed, planned, and monitored, and working on kind of tools around data packages is something that I very much enjoy doing. Also running events, in particular hackathons, Libraries Hacked. I'm super excited to get to know you and to meet you, and because I think getting people together to create little prototypes and develop ideas is a wonderful thing to do with open data. And yeah, I develop also kind of platforms and tools to make hackathons great again. And yeah, that's me. And Lily, you're last but not least.
Thank you, Oleg. I'm Lily. I'm the product manager of Frictionless, and I'm super excited to hear this presentation. Really happy, Dave, that you could reschedule. And let's see, I'm in Austin, Texas, and my library connection is that after grad school, I briefly worked in a library, physically in the library, technically different department, but we did have a lot of meetings with librarians, so I think it still counts. Yes, and I guess with that, I'll hand it back to you, Sarah.
Yes, and I will hand it to you, Dave. If you want, you can start your presentation now.
Yeah, perfect. And thank you so much for the, feels like a really welcoming group, so that's great. So I'll share my screen. And do let me know if anyone can't see my slides. So what I'll do is I'm going to go through a presentation, and there's a few things that I can show, through a browser. So I'll go through the presentation first, and then go through the browser. But thank you very much so much for inviting me. And I've used frictionless data for a bit, particularly on this project, but also in other projects. And it's one of those things where I've kind of used it because it's something on the internet and not really got deep into who it's run by or who's involved in it. So it's kind of a bit embarrassing that I haven't really known who's behind it. So it's definitely good to get a kind of a bit more insight. And I'd kind of like to join some of the other future community calls and get a bit more knowledge of some of the underlying people working on it. So a bit about me. Obviously, I've done an introduction, but I'm a software developer, have been for about 20 years or so. I'm a geospatial specialist, so I've worked in kind of geospatial companies, particularly as a consultant. Primarily, that's about sort of maps and data normally, and that very much comes out in the projects that I'm going to show you. So everything I do, I tend to try and bring in an element of location, and my kind of excuse for it is always that everything happens somewhere. So I kind of tend to think that geospatial has an element that belongs everywhere, but in reality, what it means is that everything I create ends up being a map or a digital map in some form. I particularly love dogs, so I try to also bring dogs into everything I do, which is quite difficult, particularly within library and software. But somehow I managed to squeeze them in there. And I'm a big passionate fan of libraries, so I do have a background in working with libraries, but actually a lot of the work I do is sort of just having a passion for libraries and working with libraries rather than in libraries. And so a bit of my data background. So in 2014, I joined as software developer at Bath and North East Somerset Council, which is a local council in the southwest of England. And sort of maybe unofficially, my role started to become a data publisher. So there was a big open data program going on in Bath at that time. And just by the nature of being in IT and being in software development, I suddenly realized I had access to all these data sources. So within a local council, you have all sorts of things to do with licensing, to do with bin collection, to do with noise complaints, to do with parking, pretty much everything that kind of goes on in a local authority. And it was a really lucky time to be there because I had access to all this data. We had a policy to release open data almost without exception. Obviously, personal data and security risk data was exempt, but effectively we had a policy just to release loads and loads of data. So I started doing that and sort of releasing things like live car parking data, so you could see the occupancy of the car parks at any time, which is still running actually. So I'm quite pleased I've got scripts that are from 2014 are still going and still publishing open data. And that also coincided with a really good community group. So we briefly discussed hackathons in those introductions, but there's a developer group in Bath called Bath Hacked. and they ran very regular hackathons and actually just community meetups to use not just the Bath Council data, but all kinds of data sources. So we did things like, we did a project to kind of make sure we'd mapped in Bath all the accessibility information of all public buildings, so people could use sort of, there's an app called Wheel Map, so for wheelchair users or people with other mobility needs could go and see whether a building had, you know, step-free access or whether it had accessible toilets and all kinds of things. So it's really kind of great time to be in Bath and kind of be a software developer in that kind of community sense. And from that, because I had this kind of interest in libraries, I decided to, I kind of thought, well, okay, that's great for general development, but what about library data? And I wanted to do things like create a library finder and use library data and use library catalog data. So I thought, okay, I'm going to start something called Libraries Hacked. So let's do hackathons about library data, you know, because loads of people love libraries, we love books, you know, there's loads of data held by libraries, loads of interesting things like, you know, what books people are taking out. So I formed Libraries Hacked and very quickly realized that there was very little data, public data on libraries, to an almost absurd extent. Like I couldn't find what libraries there were in England or the locations or that kind of thing. So it's been since then maybe kind of a very rewarding but also frustrating journey to work with public library data. But I'm interested in all things open data and open source as well. So everything I create, I try to make open source. And so just a bit about my understanding of frictionless data. So frictionless data was something I discovered, and I was aware of the Open Knowledge Foundation as well. But as I understand it, it's a set of useful information about data and standards for sharing data, a set of tools for people to use data. So I've used some of them myself, things like kind of validating CSV files and all those kind of things. Software development tools, particularly for using data, and also just general good practice in all things data. That's not a great elevator pitch for frictionless data. I'm sure you have a better one, but that's kind of my wholesale kind of understanding of frictionless data, and I'd certainly like to understand a bit more about it. And so what about public libraries? So I'm definitely coming from a UK focus, although I have actually been working recently with a US company that want to do a lot more in the kind of data space with US libraries. So hopefully that's something that we can kind of sort of share practice as well. But within the UK, we've got about 4,000 library branches, maybe about kind of 3,000 to 3,500 or so of those are England. They're administered, as Sheila said, they're administered by local authorities. So there's maybe about 200 or so local authorities in the UK that administer libraries, and they pretty much have autonomy over, you know, what goes on in a set of libraries that they manage. There's also some national bodies, so various bodies. There's a body called the Arts Council that provide funding in different ways for libraries. The DCMS is the organization, the government organization that have oversight of libraries. And some other bodies like Libraries Connected are a kind of collective of heads of service that kind of can do some things with regards to libraries in terms of joined up working. And also staffed, so libraries are staffed by information professionals, so they have great skills in metadata and signposting to local and national information. So I mentioned there's kind of lots of frustrations from working with public libraries and kind of trying to get hold of public library open data. And a few of these things are, there's definitely a lack of sharing and no standards for data sharing in libraries. So I couldn't find anything that sort of said, you know, if you want to share the locations of your libraries, here's how to do it. There are bits and pieces of people doing that. So you might find, if you go on say data.gov.uk, you might find some library service have done an export of the locations of their library branches, but that might have happened 10 years ago, and another one might have done it 5 years ago. And they'll all be in different formats. They might hold, you know, relevant, similar columns. So, you know, library name will probably match, you know, but some of them might have coordinates in different coordinate spatial systems, you know, different formats of data. So basically, as I'm sure everyone here will be familiar with, you know, a mishmash of data standards that mean you can probably integrate, say, with one library service and one data set, but you can't kind of combine them together in any effective way. And also there's a couple of points here, which there's definitely focus within libraries on performance analysis and whether that library service is good or not, which I don't have too much interest in. I know it's a good thing for public transparency, but I'm primarily interested in interesting data about libraries, getting hold of the catalog, getting hold of what people are reading, what stuff is in my local library. I don't really want to know whether one library service is better than another in terms of how much budget they have or whatever they do. I just want to get hold of a load of library data to use it in interesting ways. There's also, to be fair, I think a lack of data or technical skills within library services. So I don't want to be too critical of library service because they simply don't have, say, data analysis or really even development skills or particularly technical skills. A lot of that has now been outsourced to the suppliers that provide them in IT, so that they're not really doing a lot in terms of the kind of technical space, and don't necessarily have the skills or resources to do so. And also, I mean, I was talking about Bath Hacked. I kind of come from a community group that I've done a lot with kind of civic data, and I tend to find also there's not a lot of engagement between library services and maybe the things that are going on between open data communities and sort of data communities that exist, which is a shame because there's a lot of actually shared skills. And when we talk about information professionals, we're talking about metadata and all sorts of different skills that really match the kind of things that we want from open data, and open data portals need good metadata and need good technical standards. So there's definitely real opportunity for libraries to kind of collaborate with open data groups or just generally data groups. So I've talked a bit about the problems in libraries, but I mean, what am I talking about in terms of what data libraries hold? So it's kind of the sky's the limit in terms of what things you can imagine libraries have in terms of data. But this is just a selection of things. So membership is, say, the people who use libraries, and they might be card holders. So obviously there's kind of every library service will have a huge database of their membership, probably where they live, what books they've taken out. Obviously a certain amount of that data is personal data, or a lot of that data is personal data, but that's one of the things they hold. Items borrowed, so what items in the catalog are being borrowed, how often they're being borrowed. The building use as well. Most libraries kind of track building use, so they'll know who is going in and out of libraries, sometimes on a survey basis, sometimes on a kind of a live kind of tracker basis. So I did work in Bath and North East Somerset. We had live cameras on the doors, so you could kind of see how many people were in the library at any one time. I did really want to kind of publish that as open data and kind of have a dashboard where you could see how busy the library was, but I never got around to doing it, unfortunately, because I thought that would have been really good to kind of, I quite like going in when it's quiet, so I could see, oh, the library's only got 10 people in at the moment, I'm gonna pop in, or it's got 100 people in, I'm gonna avoid it, which again would have been really good, I think, during the kind of social distancing time as well, but maybe one day. I've also mentioned locations of libraries, so literally the sort of geographic location and all the associated data that could go along with that, and things like opening hours. So mobile library stops, we have a lot of mobile libraries in the UK, but there's no standard data for standard way of, or actually there wasn't a standard way of publishing mobile library data. So you normally just find it on PDFs on individual websites. And then things like titles in the catalog, and also people attending events. So one of the kind of unsung aspects of libraries these days is they run loads and loads of events. So events for parents and children, events for adults, all kinds of events, things like rhyme time and baby bounce, and all kinds of events to tackle loneliness in adults. So yeah, one major aspect of the library is not just reading, it's just also running lots of events, which they have, again, lots of data on. So all kind of, I suppose everyone in the sector knows the problems. There's just not necessarily an easy answer to dealing with them. And certainly, as Sheila mentioned earlier, there's no one in denial about the fact that there's a lack of data sharing and a kind of lack of innovation within the data area of libraries. So there was a meeting in 2019 to kind of tackle this problem. And it soon became obvious that we needed a sector-led solution, so something that actually engaged the library practitioners within all the different services, and not something that someone maybe externally was just going to say, this is what I'm going to do, or I'm going to collect a load of data, or I'm going to do something that doesn't involve people within the library services, because that ends up never being maintained. And, you know, you end up with situations where I might have an organization managing something for a year or for a shorter period of time, but then it kind of falls by the wayside, and you have to work within the structures you have. So at the moment, we do have a structure of, say, 200 local authorities. And if we're going to have good combined data, that's going to need 200 local authorities to be engaged. So we had a project to gather data practitioners from across library services. It was in England because DCMS remit is in England rather than UK. And the first step was to create data schemas. And this is kind of where frictionless data comes in. So with a group of others, we looked at kind of creating 7 core data sets, which actually the data sets I've just described in a couple of the previous slides, so membership, events, those kind of things. It's by no means a comprehensive set of data about, you know, in terms of what libraries hold and what goes on in libraries, but it was sort of like felt like a good core for, you know, for what everyone could kind of get to a standard of publishing could be. There was a number of meetings, and there was a Slack group to kind of spend quite a number of months kind of talking about what different libraries could do, you know, how we could kind of coordinate what was possible in some libraries, what wasn't possible in other library systems, a load of interesting stuff about the different software solutions that libraries use, which actually affected the way in which things could be published. So things like membership actually differs a lot between different library software. So some library software has a concept of an active member within a library service, so someone who's a kind of current user of the library. In some cases, that includes things like ebook usage or using the computers within the libraries, and in some other cases, it doesn't include those things. So there's obviously some complexities in terms of sharing data, and actually that data being valid between sort of valid for comparison at least. So you see, I've got a clip here of one thing we definitely also wanted to do is make it a technical data schema. So we didn't just want something vague, which was like, oh, you can publish membership data. And there was a definite requirement for having a technical definition of what the data set should be. So we used a table schema, which I'm assuming kind of frictionless data people are aware of, as a sort of standard for describing a table of data. So you see this, just a clip of it in JSON format, which is sort of saying what columns, you know, we understand that the data should have. So in this case, it's, you know, what local authority the library is, the name, and then some address fields. And then that's only a clip of it. So there's other ones in terms of geospatial columns and opening hours and all sorts of definitions for a location of a library. So we use a table schema to make a clear definition of what we expected from these 7 different data sets, and also created a website. So there's a website called schema.librarydata.uk, which has some extensive examples of the data that we collected with different library services, and also has all the technical schemas themselves. So just a bit about the tools used. As I said, it's got table schema for the formal definition of the data schemas. There are some tools which I'll show in a moment, which have used some of the sort of software libraries, so JavaScript table schema, to actually validate the data. We use things like Good Tables, the website, I think, which sort of validates a CSV file, both that it's a valid CSV file, but also that it's a valid CSV file against a particular schema. And I know there's potentially a lot of other tools that could be really useful for libraries. I think certainly in terms of data publishing, I think there's tools like Data Hub and publishing tools, which would be really useful for libraries to use in terms of sort of doing standard publishing and being able to put CSV files onto the web in a standard format. Because some library services have different access to the web, you know, some don't necessarily have a place to put things, don't have access to the local authorities open data portals or the government open data portal. So there could be a lot of use for things like Data Hub and other publishing tools to kind of gather that data together. So a bit about future plans as well. So obviously this happened in 2019, and we're talking now in 2021. So the plan was in early 2020 to kind of take these onto the road and present them across the library services. Now, obviously, in early 2020, stuff happened, and libraries, suddenly the priorities for libraries changed quite understandably. So everyone was sort of suddenly going, we need to go online, we need to do different things. So I remember it was almost, I think it was in February or March, I was doing a presentation to Libraries Connected, so a lot of heads of services talking about the data schemas, and it was things happened so amazingly fast. You know, within a couple of weeks, everyone was in lockdown and nothing was happening. So we had a setback, obviously, in terms of kind of pushing these data schemas. A lot of libraries, as I say, stopped physical use, but there are some good stories. So Barnet have been going with the data schemas. So I'm going to show in a few moments the Barnet Open Data Portal, which has data to these data schemas, and also some uses of that data that we can kind of promote with libraries. There's also quite a lot of ongoing data strategies in progress, which will use these schemas. So I know the Arts Council are in the middle of a data strategy exercise in which they've explicitly mentioned these schemas being a key part of or wanting to kind of integrate with. So hopefully that will be something that kind of really takes off. And I've also been creating tools which kind of use these data schemas and rely on these data schemas for their underlying data, kind of as a way of doing prototyping to kind of show to libraries that here's things we could do if you had this data and if we could combine this data. So there's a few screenshots, although I will do demos of these, so I'll quickly run through the screenshots. So one example is actually, we talked about one of the data sets being membership data. One thing we can do with the membership data schema is, because it has a geospatial element to it, as in terms of where the individual members live, although it's anonymized, it allows us to map. So potentially if we had the UK data, we could map across the UK exactly the kind of population percentages that we use in libraries, you know, in small areas. So I've got a kind of screenshot here showing this is actually real data from Barnet, showing that, you know, in the small area, we sort of have sort of 47% use as libraries. In other areas, you have sort of 27% and smaller. And then on the left-hand side, as you kind of go out of Barnet, obviously, then you have just people who use their other library service, but still use Barnet libraries. So maybe sort of 5% or 4% of people go into Barnet. They're not a resident of Barnet, but they use the library service. I've got a tool called Library Map, which is using the locations of libraries. So we did actually manage to get together, and the Arts Council have been getting together a location data set of the libraries across the UK. And one thing I wanted to do with that would actually do a bit more analysis on location. So what this does is a tool which allows you to actually select any library and see the kind of walking distances in terms of 5-minute, 10-minute, and 15-minute radiuses. But also, I mean, you might not be able to see it in the screenshot, but it has the population numbers within those kind of distances. So you can kind of see that in this particular library, there's 826 people within a 5-minute walk. And this kind of, I envisage as a tool that libraries could use to kind of assess maybe their different libraries in terms of maybe how many people are within a walking distance of it, how many people have to drive to it, you know, or cycle, or whatever the method of transport is. And then I'll show this project as well in a moment, but the mobile libraries is one I'm really particularly keen on, because we had no data standards for mobile libraries at all before this. And mobile libraries are fascinating because they're, you know, they move. So, you know, normal libraries are boring in the sense that they just stay in one place, you know, all the time. But mobile libraries go everywhere. And, you know, we've probably got in the UK about 15,000 mobile library stops. So, you know, it really expands the network of libraries in terms of, you know, you might have only a few thousand branches, but if you have 15,000 stops, you've got these moving libraries effectively that can go anywhere and be put anywhere. I don't think we necessarily make full use of that. And that's mainly because we don't have the data. You know, we have quite clunky ways of kind of constructing a mobile library route, which is maybe done once every decade for a library service. Whereas I think they could be a lot more dynamic. And also just in terms of providing that data to people is kind of, as I say, it's kind of very hidden away at the moment, not often in PDFs on service websites. And then another example I did last year using the locations of libraries was actually to analyze the relationship between libraries and high streets. So we have data sets in quite a good data set in the UK, which is all the locations of our high streets, which are mapped by our geospatial main kind of national geospatial company called Ordnance Survey. And they mapped all the high streets in the UK. They had a formal definition for what a high street meant. And what I did was merge that with locations of our libraries and was able to kind of make some assumptions or kind of come to some conclusions about how libraries related to high streets. And it was quite often that libraries weren't on high streets, so we're kind of maybe 5 minutes walk away. That tends to be quite a common situation. Whereas people often talk about the library and high street being kind of sort of co-synchronous, almost like associated with each other. But actually, there's lots of libraries across the UK in different situations, in different quite often in rural areas as well as non-rural areas and urban areas. So that's in terms of the presentation. I have got a few things that it would be useful to show. So firstly, that website I was mentioning, so Public Library Open Data, schema.librarydata.uk. It goes into each one of those data sets, and there's a lot more information about the data set. This was mainly done through workshops with the library services to kind of understand what the definition, say, of a member was, you know, what the definition of what these different columns were that we were using. But there's also the formal table schema, technical schemas, so we kind of link to the formal definition of each data set as well, which can be used. And so this is Barnet Library. So Barnet is a borough within London, library service, and you can see that they're publishing 5 of these data sets on quite a regular basis. So if I go into the library membership one, I can see that they're publishing kind of regular membership data. So this actually includes a summary of where their members live in an anonymized way, because we use standard geospatial areas used for statistics, and they're publishing that regularly. And one thing I was going to show, if I can get rid of the zoom bar, or maybe I just have to shift around it. So I did create a tool. So one of the things I wanted to do off the back of these data schemas was to encourage libraries to use them. So not just the sense that this is something you have to do for no good reason. It would be a case of, here's something you could do, publish your data and actually use it in some really useful way. So I've got a membership map explorer. So if I go into load up, so I pre-downloaded that Barnet file, and I'm going to click add members to map. And what that does is it analyzes that data that Barnet have created and plots it on a map to actually show you those percentages of membership against the current population in different areas. So Barnet can kind of come along, and it's also actually got the locations of libraries. You can see the kind of green dots. So Barnet so it's actually merging into two of those data sets together. So Barnet can come along and sort of say, okay, we're going to have a look at our membership. All we need to do is create this standard output data, load it up into this tool, and we can start to look at sort of areas. For some reason in this area, we only have 13% of the population who are library members, whereas in other areas we have 40, 50%, which is potentially a really useful tool for libraries to kind of target areas in which they're kind of missing out in terms of membership, or for some reason not attracting the local population. So hopefully that will be useful to libraries. I did run a trial also with about 15 or so library services to use this tool, and got some really good feedback. So we're going to develop it further. And for library services, all it does depend on is for them just to be able to generate the data, really, and then hopefully they can generate it openly, because it's all anonymous, and other people can explore it as well. And then I'll show maybe as one example the mobile library site. So what this is using the data schema for mobile library timetables. So that schema is basically a row for every stop that mobile libraries stop at, and it has a timetable to say the frequency of stops. So the frequency might be, once every Thursday, or once every other Thursday, or the third Thursday of the month. It kind of covers different frequencies that they could use. But this kind of allows people to kind of search for their nearest mobile library stop across a load of different mobile libraries in the UK, and it kind of finds your nearest. What it also does is, because we have that definition of frequency and also the locations that the mobile libraries are going to, it estimates the kind of current location of the mobile library on the road that it might be. So if I kind of hover over these, this one says it's arriving at a school in 18 minutes. And if I kind of zoom into it, you'll see it's between stops at the moment. So it's kind of estimated its location on the road between its stops. And how I kind of imagine this working is a bit like you have for buses and trains. It's kind of like a tracker, so people can kind of see. I can see my mobile library is 5 minutes away, or it's running late, or technically we could get GPS onto the mobile libraries and actually kind of compare the kind of estimated times with the the current location, which would be really nice. So this was kind of another kind of proof of concept to say that we can, with combined data for mobile libraries, we can both map the mobile libraries across the UK, also have additional features like live GPS, but also provide a really useful view for the public, so the public can kind of do things like see where the mobile library currently is. I did imagine things like having dynamic stops, so almost like kind of hailing your mobile library. So if you see that it's sort of coming down the road, you go, oh, I want to grab a book or something like that, or I want to take a book back, and say, could you just stop, maybe at sort of certain predefined locations, which is a lot more, I kind of think is a lot better than the kind of typical mobile library, as I say, PDF or kind of document you find on a website somewhere, and quite often people don't know about, or in many situations actually still the data is so hard to describe that some services still make it a kind of phone line only, so you have to phone up to find when your mobile library is next coming, which isn't necessarily the greatest thing in the kind of the digital age. But that was it really from the presentation. Kind of happy to show all sorts of things, but that was kind of a breakdown of the project. So yeah, definitely gained a lot from using the frictionless data tools. Having a real defined data schema was really useful. We have now a set of data schemas that I'm certainly making use of, but also we have a few library services making use of and publishing under, and hopefully it's a case of that kind of snowballing and kind of putting together these prototypes and kind of showing people what they can do, all with the underlying basis of just having standard data, which it is really, whatever software tools there might be and whatever kind of websites, it's basically you have standard data, you can share it, you can do things with it together basically. So that was it really. I assume it's kind of questions and discussion.
Yes, exactly. Thanks very much, Dave.
No worries.
It was very amazing to see that. I didn't mention that before, but before joining the Open Knowledge Foundation, I worked for an advocacy program for libraries, and a big problem was the lack of data. So it's great to see standards and tools being developed for that. Let's maybe open the floor for questions.
I'll just stop sharing so we can. Yeah, thank you.
Got a question. I actually have a few questions, but I'll just do one first. Thank you. That was really interesting. So my first question is, do all of the libraries that you've encountered collect data digitally, or do any of them do this by hand? Because I thought about this because you're mentioning, or I think one of the websites said that if there's less than 5 members, then that data won't be shown. And I was like, oh, if there's a library that only has 5 members, maybe they're not doing things digitally.
No, so the majority of libraries that are doing things digitally, and certainly for these data schemas, we chose data sets that we knew there were digital sources for, because there will be lots of manual data sources, but we primarily wanted data sets that we could share practice on, extracting data from systems, because there's not that many library systems. Actually, there's sort of maybe about 5 or so library systems, even though they each have their individual instances, like a library management system. There's about 5 suppliers basically. So we tried to go with data sources that we knew there were digital sources for. It does vary in some of these data sets. So actually the one about mobile libraries normally have been designed, depending on the library service, they might have designed their mobile library routes and their stops on paper, and they'll have put them into as I say, maybe a Word document and published it as a PDF. So that's one that's actually, by having a digital standard for it, it's actually proposed that could almost be like, as opposed to an export standard, that could almost be like the way in which libraries store the data and then present it. And I've been experimenting with things like generating a PDF timetable from the data schema itself, so from the data standard, because then that shortcuts some of their processes, because they have to create PDFs and create documents and all sorts of things. Whereas if we encourage them to store the data in a basically just in a spreadsheet, they could then use tools to then present it digitally and embed things on their website or create documentation, documents from it. But yeah, primarily the mention of less than 5 was actually the membership data set. So it wasn't so much that a library would have less than 5 members, it was that a particular area. So we have these statistical areas in the UK, which are called LSOAs, and basically they come from census data, basically. So they're normally made up of, so those particular ones are made up of roughly 1,500 people. So a library might have less than 5 people within that area. In terms of their membership, they'll probably have a larger membership overall, but within that particular area, they might have less than 5 people, and sometimes no people. And the only reason to publish to anonymize at less than 5 is that that's a sort of standard for not revealing individual people. So we didn't want a situation where we're saying that within this area we know we've got 1 member, because then someone might go, well, I know who that is because I know they're a library member, and then you get into all that kind of danger of big data and people merging together data sets and kind of understanding bits stuff about people they don't, they have no business of doing. So yeah, we generally tend to say less than 5. We anonymize the data to say we have membership in this area, but we're not going to say it's 1, 2, or 3 people or whatever.
Yeah, that makes sense. Thanks for that answer.
That's right.
I was, I may ask a question next?
Yeah.
I was wondering, you've mentioned a lot of really cool data sources that, libraries being source of various data like membership, building use. But I was wondering about funding data. You didn't seem to make any mention about library budgets, except the fact that 15% were community run and the rest were government funded. So I assume for the government funded one, you could more easily access spending data, but it's quite interesting to find out how many acquisitions are made, how many, this kind of type of information. Is that what you track as well?
And that's a difficult one to, so that's another one which is difficult to kind of aggregate. So we do have a body in the UK that collect that data annually, and they're called CIPRA, and they're an accountancy body, and they've traditionally collected data like how much the library budget is, things like how much is spent, like you say, on acquisitions, on different types of acquisitions, so children's stock, non-fiction, fiction, all those kind of things. It's a very manual process, and it only happens annually at the moment. So it didn't necessarily fit in with what we were doing, because we were kind of looking at things that could be exported from systems maybe on a real-time basis, or maybe monthly or quite detailed export frequencies. But yeah, you're right. I mean, there is a lot of useful data and interesting data on the financials and the kind of budgets. And I mean, one thing we do go into is the locations of libraries have the library type. So we have a number of different library types in the UK. So we have local authority run libraries, community run libraries, which normally have some support by the local authority, and then purely independent libraries. So quite a lot of libraries have kind of are now running under almost a completely independent model. And then we also have, I forget what the name of it is, but we have outsourced libraries. So libraries that are run by maybe a private or a charity body, but still kind of funded by the local authority. So we do have a lot of kind of different budgetary models for libraries. But yeah, that data traditionally has been quite a manually collected, and was difficult to kind of come up with we could perhaps come up with a schema for, but quite difficult to kind of follow. And particularly the people that we were working with were the data practitioners in libraries, who weren't necessarily the people involved in the budget side of things. So we wanted to kind of focus on things like, you know, the book issues and the kind of things that they were using day to day.
Is it worth just me saying that also the other problem with the CIPFA data, and we had a very good intern who did some interesting analysis of the CIPFA data, which is the data set that Dave mentioned. And part of the problem, particularly with the finance, is that every local authority doesn't allocate its finances in the same way, following exactly the same protocols. So some will allocate building costs to library budgets, and others will have building costs covered elsewhere, for example. So it's very difficult to be really clear on exactly how the funding is working. And as Dave says, there are public sector mutuals, which is where a whole library service has been spun out into being an independent organisation, but commissioned by the council. And there's also some outsourcing too. For example, there's one organisation that runs 5 different library service operations across the country. So, you know, it's quite interesting looking at analysing between the different library services that one organisation runs and seeing the differentials there. So it's not an easy picture, let's say.
There's a really interesting point also as well about one thing you mentioned there, Sheila, about sort of data standardization. And we had a lot of questions on all the data sets actually about how do we make this data standard between library services. So the kind of questions like, for example, one of the data sets is about the book issues, and we try to, we don't go down to the level of recording every book issue, but we do book issues by item type. So the item type might be, you know, adult fiction or, you know, adult non-fiction, or all different item types that a library holds. But they obviously don't hold item types in the same way, and some of them have some items and some of them don't have other items, or they describe them differently. And there's kind of 2 options you have there, where you either go, we want everyone to be the same and to kind of convert all their item types into this standard set that we're going to go and create. Or you go, well, we're just going to accept that everyone's different and actually just publish your item type and, you know, number of issues you've had per month, or whatever, you know, whatever it might be. And we'll accept that we've got different data, because that's actually the reality. You know, we're not going to kind of cover over it and say, you've all got the same data. We're actually going to say, well, we know there's going to be a lot of differences. And it's going to be difficult to compare, because you've got something you call this one thing and other people call it another thing. But that actually is the reality. So in some cases we've got definitions of those data schemas which say just publish under whatever you call it, and that's fine, because that's actually the reality of the situation.
I had what is maybe a quick question, and I might just try to put 2 in there. So first question is like, yeah, just how, like, thanks for the presentation. The question is how you actually plan on having this data be made available for everyone. Is it through local authorities' data portals, the data.gov.uk? Is it something that's just on the library website? Kind of, and yeah, that would be nice to know. And then maybe just a little bit side on that is like, is there interoperability with known standards? Like, you know, for the mobile library GTFS, might the global transit feed specification, you know, describes routes, describes stops, describes scheduled, you know, times at which things are be scheduled to form, and the kind of relation between them. So I was wondering about that one. I was wondering about like MARC integration with the actual catalog the library might have if they have things defined in like a standard schema catalog, like MARC or something.
Yeah. So first question. I've almost slipped my mind.
Yeah. How to download and get the data.
Download. Yeah. So the proposal initially was certainly that actually people would do their own thing, and again, this probably goes back to the fact that lots of authorities are kind of obligated to either use maybe their local open data portal or or not to, or to use data.gov.uk, or, you know, as you say, to use a certain system. A lot of them don't have access. A lot of them might have other requirements where, you know, they have to get sign off from certain people to publish data. So certainly Barnet, for example, when I showed Barnet, they're publishing on their local open data portal, and they have to get sign off, you know, whenever they want to publish a new set of data. So that was very much their requirement. So certainly initially the goal was actually just to get people publishing, and to say, you know, just get publishing. You know, it's not an ideal situation that we won't have everything in one place, but, you know, we will have people publishing under the same standard. And then maybe we can think about, you know, combined data portals, or just a single place which actually just grabs all the different data sets, you know, from wherever they are, you know, so just aggregates, you know, just understands where all the different data is and pulls it together. You know, so there's a few options you could then have for actually either having the data all in one place, or having an understanding of where all the data sets exist. In terms of standards, so for, say, things like the mobile libraries schema, we did look at things like the transit routes. It didn't quite match up, and also I found one of our requirements was to make things simple for library services and the data practitioners within libraries. And I found that a really complicated standard, which I have used before, but it has a really difficult, you probably know it, you know, has a really difficult kind of, you know, to get your head around it is quite difficult. But we did try to use standards. So for example, with the frequency column for the mobile library, you know, how frequently does it arrive at a particular stop? We use the calendar rule standard. So I don't know if you know, sort of Outlook and other calendars have something called the R rule, which is a sort of way of defining, you know, like a repeating event as a recurring event. So we use that standard to store that data, which is quite a simple one actually to understand and just to look at, in terms of it's a text-based format. So it wasn't too complicated to kind of show libraries to say, okay, this is how we're storing this frequency data. You can actually type it yourself, you know, if you want to type it. But the goal is actually also to provide tools so that they can kind of maybe maintain those mobile library stops and frequency with a visual interface. And similar things for, so library opening hours, we use the standard, which is used by a number of places. That's also used by Google actually, in terms of when you load in, you know, Google businesses, you can kind of update your opening hours on Google. So we wanted to kind of create a data source which potentially they could upload into Google and maintain their opening hours in Google, and then also maintain as open data. So they weren't sort of doing things in multiple places. And then on the question on MARC, so we didn't go down too far the route of detailed catalog data. We have summary title data, which is almost like, again, what I was talking about, how many items you hold of particular item types. But certainly if we were going down the route of your whole catalog, which there was a lot of resistance actually from library services of publishing. I think they're a bit nervous about the state of their catalogs. I don't know if that might chime with some people who work in libraries, but there was a lot of resistance to publishing the whole catalog. But perhaps we'll get there, and certainly go into using things like MARC. But yeah, I think a lot of libraries were nervous about detailed and kind of expansive data like publishing the catalog.
Thanks, Dave. I just want to be mindful of time, and we have 1 minute left. So thanks again for the presentation, and thanks all of you for coming to the community call. Before saying bye, maybe just a few things that we wanted to announce. First thing is that probably you've already seen it on Discord, but we're planning to host a hackathon in October. So it's going to be a 2-day virtual event to create new project prototypes based on existing Frictionless open source code. And we are still deciding on the date. So if you go on the Discord channel, you can vote. So I invite you to do so. And then the second thing that we wanted to announce is that we're still recruiting the 3rd cohort of Frictionless Fellows. I don't know if Lily, you want to briefly say 2 words about that very quickly, because we don't have a lot of time.
Yeah, sure. We're recruiting early career researchers, so graduate students, postdocs, people that have recently finished either of those things and are in some field of research, so science or humanities. And we are going to teach them open science best practices and how to use frictionless tools to manage their work. And It is a 9-month program, involves a lot of mentorship with me and a $5,000 stipend as well. And there's a lot more info on our website, so check it out. And if you have any questions, feel free to email me, or if you know somebody that you think would be a good fit, please share with them. And I'm happy to talk to anybody in more details as well. And applications close at the end of the month.
Thanks. The other thing that I wanted to mention is that this month we're very lucky and we have 2 community calls. So there's one coming up in 2 weeks. We're going to have Imbe York and Adam Shepard from Bicodimo, who actually run a pilot on frictionless data pipelines. So that's going to be very interesting. You will see announcement anyhow on Discord and Twitter, but you can sign up through the form that you used also for this call today. I think that's it for me. Lily, do you have anything else that you want to add?
Just thank you. That was a really interesting presentation.
Yeah, thank you so much, Dave, and thanks all for coming to the call. I'll see you in 2 weeks.
No, thank you for delaying as well. And I was pleased to get around to finally presenting to you.
Great. Thanks so much. Bye, everybody.
Take care. Bye.
Thank you. Bye, everyone.